Welcome to Jackson Lewis's podcast, We Get Work. Focused solely on workplace issues, it is our job to help employers develop proactive strategies, strong policies, and business-oriented solutions to cultivate an engaged, stable, and inclusive workforce. Our podcast identifies issues that influence and impact the workplace and its continuing evolution, and helps answer the question on every employer's mind: how will my business be impacted? Leveraging data is one of an organization's most valuable assets. Metrics measure market competitiveness and help ensure pay equity and compliance with federal and state laws and regulations. On this episode of We Get Work, we speak with Kyla Pavlina, the Chief People Officer at Scipher Medicine. Kyla discusses how companies can use data as a powerful tool to bridge the gaps between emotions and evidence when organizations discuss compensation and equity. Our co-host is Sarah Skubis, principal in Jackson Lewis's Hartford office and co-leader of the firm's healthcare industry group. Sarah and Kyla, the question on everyone's mind today is: how can data drive clarity and accountability and measure success when discussing compensation and equity? And how does that impact my business?
Hello, it's Sarah Skubis with Jackson Lewis, co-chair of the Healthcare Industry Group. Thank you for joining our podcast series. I am thrilled today to have with me Kyla Pavlina, the Chief People Officer at Scipher Medicine. She has a passion for today's topic, is a dynamic leader, and we're just really thrilled to have her join us today. So thank you for joining us today, Kyla. Kyla is with Scipher Medicine, a precision immunology company. She's got a really extensive background. She has taken companies public. She's managed significant employee growth for various large companies, including taking a biotech company from 80 to over 1,700 plus employees in a 7-month span. That could not have been easy. She's grown other large companies from 80 to over 5,000 employees, along with navigating international growth. And so we're really thrilled to have your expertise here today, Kyla. We are excited to talk about a topic I know you feel really passionate about. So let's kind of jump right in. So we're going to be discussing data and really how to utilize it to de-emotionalize the discussions around compensation and equity that you have all the time, I'm sure, as Chief People Officer. Can you tell us just a little bit about how you first became interested in utilizing data as a Chief People Officer role?
Absolutely. Thank you, Sarah, for the warm welcome. Data is one of the most powerful tools we have as business leaders. It bridges that gap between emotions and evidence. So the thing that I like about it is that it drives clarity, accountability, and measures success, right? So when we're trying to make that positional move from HR personnel managers into business partners and really be an influential business leader, data is going to be one of the cornerstones that builds that trust and moves our profession into that space more readily. You know, I go back and I think about in the original moments mirroring finance about 15 years ago. 15 years ago, finance underwent this huge transformational change. They were accountants, and now we look at them as business leaders. In fact, some of the most important, second to that of the CEO. The CPO, our role, is starting to go through that transition as well, because we're no longer just the people or the emotional fillers, and we don't do things after the fact. We're now being leveraged strategically beforehand, and data is one of the best ways to kind of make that change steady.
It makes perfect sense, right, Kyla, when you're talking about it. Using empirical data to make decisions, it's totally common sense, but you're right? In the world of human resources or people work, right? We think about it more as a focus on the soft skills or sort of those non-data driven performance factors.
Absolutely.
So it's a hard shift for a lot of people, I actually think. Can you tell us a little bit about how you actually go about utilizing data as a Chief People Officer to make those decisions?
Absolutely. Great question. I think it's the one that gives us the ability to use it more readily. And 3 big things. I do this like clockwork when I'm looking at data. First is know your audience. What do they care about? What's important to them? Second is, if you know the person, how do they receive the information? So it's different when you're talking to your CEO or your board or your fellow colleagues that are other leaders. But if you know that person and you know how they receive information, what I mean by that is sound bites, tons of data. What type of person are they and how do they digest data? And third is, what are the patterns and personal value system of the person you're trying to influence or you're presenting the data to? If you can look at those three and consider all three before using data and trying to influence a decision, you're going to have more success. So always starting with, what's my goal? What am I trying to solve? Who's my audience? Who am I talking to? What do they care about? And what's their personal value system if you have that close of a relationship? I think the other key tip, the one that we always learn the best when we make mistakes, right? And it sticks with us the longest, this for sure is absolutely mine. Data is not a one size fits all. There is not one piece of data I can look at you and say, hey, as a CPO, if you use this, you're always going to have great results. That's not true because now you're avoiding the audience, the personal, and the value system that I started with. So data is not a one size fits all. And I think the last tip with starting to use data and making that transition, because it's not something that's been the history of HR, which I affectionately call people ops or POPs, is it shouldn't be rigid. It should not be rigidly applied. It's always your strongest tool, but it cannot always be used for everything because it doesn't always work in every situation. So you can't just port a theory, a thought, and a data and move it amongst businesses, people you're trying to influence or employees and think it works. There's not a recipe, unfortunately.
I think that's really going to be relevant to our listeners, though, right? So you're melding the worlds of sort of what we think more traditionally business operations with those soft skills that we know are critical because we can't just put people into data points, right? Yeah. People are more complex, and that component you were talking about in terms of knowing your audience, that's where that key soft skills comes into play and being really mindful about it. I think people get scared about utilizing data too much when we're talking about, I love that POPs, or, the HR kind of realm. So if you could break it down a little bit for our listeners who might be newer to utilizing data or thinking critically about how to utilize data, I mean, what data do you actually gather? How do you get that data? Yeah. And sort of what are the benefits when you've seen the data come together in the POPs world? Yeah, that you've seen really beneficial.
Absolutely. I love that you're using POPs. It makes me so happy.
I'm gonna totally take that word as my own now. I love it.
I think it works with Laszlo Bock's book with work rules, how we were like the personnel, I call it affectionately the pooper scoopers, and we've moved into strategic business partners and it's people operations. And so it sticks quite heavily. To answer your question, data empowers them to move beyond instinct, right? It truly transforms organizations when applied correctly. So if it's a newer person to using data, or oftentimes you don't have the systems that allows you access to data, I would always recommend the unsung hero of the people ops team, which is the ops analyst. Right? So you have an HR analyst. They used to be HRS admin, and then it's kind of slowly moved into this place where you're actually able to mine data, put data together, and make it make sense. And so I would say definitely start with your talent inside your team. Who is your data person? Oftentimes in the people ops departments, it's missing. And that's why I call it the unsung hero. So start with a person that's going to help get the data, because it's not going to be you who's going to be able to do it day in and day out and making these changes as you're using it to influence. And so before you collect the data, spend time again. So first is your talent. Then you're going to spend time with the question of what am I trying to solve? Then you look at your three things: audience, personal, value system. And then one of the reasons that you start with the data analyst and then you move into the question you're trying to solve is because as humans, we have confirmation bias. And so what happens is we tend to believe so strongly in our own positions that we find information to continue to prove what we believe. And so to truly look at eliminating confirmation bias, data is one of the places to start because you can't really argue with it as much. Now, that's not the rigid thing that I said earlier, can't be rigid. But at the same time, if we're looking to de-emotionalize and we are looking to remove confirmation bias, data is going to be another place you hit as one of your cornerstone tools to start to influence. The last thing that I think resonates best with CEOs is you can measure success, you can hold yourself accountable, and you can adapt accordingly. I don't know about anyone else, but there's no project that works and comes out with flawless results. There's always a change along the way where we thought this and it's not really working, or another unintended consequence happened and we're having to course correct. If you're managing your data along the way, it's going to allow you to adapt faster and more accurately.
I love that. So you mentioned, right, equality and kind of looking at it to avoid that confirmation bias and utilizing data in that fashion. So I can think, if you're looking at compensation metrics, right, that's data a company or organization has. That feels like one data point that you can utilize to make sure you're making data-based decisions, which obviously in the world of pay equity that we all live in right now, and pay transparency issues, increasing state regulation around these issues, it's obviously a key data point that you're going to be looking. Are there other types of data that you can gather in an organization that you find can be really helpful to this data-driven decision making other than perhaps compensation?
Absolutely. It's a good question. I think the easiest way to describe this is I'm going to give you a time when data worked for me and when data didn't work, and it's not necessarily in the compensation realm. And so the question that I started with on the one time, well, not the one time, the many times that data worked, is are we equally investing in employee benefits worldwide? So at CrossFit, we had 5,000 employees worldwide. 54% of that growth was international. Quite frankly, the laws in each country and what the cultural norms or expectations are quite different. And so the question for the executive management team as they tried to acquire talent and retain the talent was, what are we investing in them and what are we getting as a rate of return? That's an easy one for CPOs is we look at attrition rates and how long it takes us to bring in people. But how are we motivating and moving along our A players, right? And let's look at the benefits and the fringe things for them as far as 401k all the way down to maternity leave, or I'd like to say parental leave, depending on where you are. This mattered as the role and responsibilities were different everywhere, right? Like, because I always think Australia and China were two countries that like permanently etched in my brain because it was so hard for me to make that data work for me. But our business line provided a certificate and courses. So what happened was there was about, probably 1,000 employees that had the exact same job, but they were in different regions. So the laws that I had to use to apply to them and how I was going to motivate them looked quite differently, but we wanted the same output in every region. And the other risk was, and the reason we asked the question, what are you trying to solve for, is we didn't want people to move. We don't want people to be in regions that are most beneficial, lucrative to them, because we needed them to be in different regions where we were teaching the courses and the certification process. And so we had to look at everyone, right? Here's the process and the data that I gathered. Talent first, right? What is the talent doing? What's their job description? I know we hate talking about those things because that's a document that's we can talk about that at another time, but I have a big problem with job descriptions that are too rigid, too lengthy, and we've just completely lost our audience and they become too legally focused. We can say that as attorneys, we can look the other way to make it a little bit more motivational. So talent first, what are these people doing? And do you have the talent on your team? Did you have your HR analyst? Did you have the system, right, to collect the data? So the second is the system. How are you collecting the data? Because if you're working in Excel, it looks markedly different than if you're working in Workday or you have a homegrown system because your business is so big they've made an HRS system. So looking at your system second, and then your process third. And when I think of process, I think of the legal requirements and the cultural expectations because they oftentimes don't match. But you need to track both of them. And so that's a large data set when you're talking about 5,000 people internationally and you're talking about, I think we were in 8 countries at the time and the laws were the same. We even classify them the same. So you have these pieces of data. And I would say that you need to take the employee benefit for the employee cost and the employer benefit. And they're two different costs for what the law requires and what the cultural expectations are. And then it starts to tell a story because you start to see patterns. First, you're going to see patterns, hopefully in every region that has the same law, that they're following the same things. The cultural is different. I'll give you one example for this exact same situation. Australia had 11%, which we call 401k. They do not call it that there. But in the United States, for example, we don't have to give 401k pension. It's a benefit. And You can match, you cannot match. It's a leveraging tool, but it is not a requirement. In Australia, one of the rules we were facing at that time was 11%. So 0% in the United States to 11% didn't mean I was treating these two groups of people exactly the same. So looking at the investments of what the employee was receiving and what the employer was paying, and then how did we right size that data? So if I have to give you 11% pension and you're in the United States and you have zero, I'm going to find another way to keep you invested, to keep you rewarded, to keep you engaged, and to keep you from moving to Australia, because that would markedly change our ability to continue to be successful, right? To drive results. So that was the time that data worked.
Particularly for healthcare industry right now, Kyla,
Yep.
right? Employee, obviously, retention is a huge issue. And healthcare employers are now more often than not navigating into the space of remote workplace than where they never had before. There have always been sort of brick and mortar employers. And so thinking strategically and utilizing data kind of leverage that remote workforce, whether it be within the US or outside, which is a new trend, is really relevant and a really critical way to look at that. I thought that was a really great example. So I think it's a really interesting thing because my gut, right, as outside counsel,
Yep.
not in the trenches like you are, would be that leaders would love this data approach, right? I think, they're business people. So the touchy feely or what they think, HR is, it doesn't always resonate with them. But it's interesting, right? It's multifaceted. And I think that's a really great example of understanding what matters to the employee base is going to help you get to the right legal compliance issue on something like a classification. But it's utilizing the data to get there in maybe a different way than you thought, requiring a little bit of creativity around that data as well. That's a really great example. I think you've touched upon it, some of those pitfalls or lessons learned in using data to de-emotionalize discussions. Is there anything else that you've learned sort of where data took you down a wrong path that you think our listeners may benefit from other than what you've already shared? I think it's been really helpful.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think the pitfalls, again, look at your talent system, all the stuff I said before, know your audience, what's your question, what are you trying to solve? But just like the CFO transition and the CPO transition, it's not being rigid. It's a gap, a bridge between the gap of the two, and being able to adapt accordingly is probably what's going to be the most helpful. Find your allies. You will always find an ally in data. There is someone somewhere on the executive team. Oftentimes it's the CFO because this person is oriented to dollars and bottom line. Find your allies in data, the people that when you speak to them about it, it resonates with them and they feel strong about it. The other interesting example in some of the businesses I have is scientists often, and scientist founders or doctors who are very much in this space. Oftentimes they're less looking at the instinct and the emotional, and they prefer and they feel much more comfortable scientists in this space. You're probably going to find some allies there. So the champions and the supporters of data are going to be your people function partner, right? To help leverage more data and more influence. Yeah, I think it's the allies.
Kyla, attrition is and remains a huge concern for the healthcare industry. How have you seen data work or not work in evaluating attrition data if you've done that?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I'm going to give you an example of one of the more difficult times or one of the more learning experiences I had with collecting attrition data. I had a comp committee chair who very much cared about regretful loss and not regretful loss. And where we started was something simple as regretful or not regretful. But as we went through the data and learned the circumstances, it ended up being way more complex because there ended up being 3 in each regretful and not regretful. And the way we learned was actually just by doing it and adapting on spot. So the board and the comp committee looking at attrition cared about a group of people that was the talent they wanted to retain, but that wasn't everyone at all stages in the business. So if the business shifted, there's oftentimes a talent pool that is less important to them at the moment. Again, know your audience. And so it probably took me 4 to 6 bites of the apple working with her to ensure the regretful and not regretful was put in a way that she cared about, when she cared about it. And it's just another reminder of not only is attrition important, data is important, but again, adapting to her audience and then making sure they're getting the information they need so that we can help influence the right decisions.
I'm just wondering, so we've touched about the benefits, the date, like the sources of data, comp benefits. Yep. Is there anything else, any other sources of data that you find really interesting or that you want to touch on? I think we hit a couple of great examples there.
There's definitely one. Again, it's more of like the unintended consequences, which is the times that you do something wrong and you learn that sits and resonates with me.
Okay.
And it's undoubtedly, I'm almost a little bit embarrassed to say it because it was the first time we went, oh, duh. We've got 12 states that have pay transparency, right? And that requires us to post job postings with a range, the band, and more information about compensation. Well, when you have employees in several states, oftentimes there is similar families, bands, or exact roles. And if you haven't done an entire analysis internally of how that maps out, your long-term A-player talent engineer who's been sitting with the business for 5 years sees a posting in California for the same role making at or the same amount that they're making. Oh, you have a problem. You have just demotivated one of your A players, right? So the pay transparency when I worked in this space is not just knowing the states and the rules that applied, but it has to be used to look at the entire analysis. And most of us have businesses and employees too big to memorize. That goes back to your HRS analyst and person who's going to start breaking it down so that you don't fall into any situation where there's an unintended consequence where you demotivated an A player in a different state.
I think that's a really great example, Kyla, because so many clients struggle with that precise issue, right? And pay transparency and the information's out there. And so reconciling those challenges, I think is going to resonate with a lot in the industry who are navigating, again, for many, an increased remote workforce where they've never had to deal with that. I want to ask you, sort of a final question for now. Mm-hmm. Again, for some of the listeners who may not have any experience in using data in the way you've done it, I think you've given some, but are there any final recommendations to get started that you would share with some of our listeners?
No, I think it would just be what I mentioned earlier as far as what other question you're trying to solve, who's your audience and what's important to them, the person and their value system. Don't be too rigid. Be able to adapt and listen. And then I think the most portable piece of advice while using data, not only for CPOs, but I think for any in a leadership position, is really listening to listen, not to be right or not to come up with a response to be right, but be willing to be influenced and learn. And oftentimes you will find exactly the right solution. And that fine line between that bridge and that gap of using two sides of your skill set is what's going to make you able to use data when and where you want and what helps the business drive success more often.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Kyla. I really appreciate you sharing your insights. It's been really illuminating, particularly for somebody like me who doesn't deal with the day-to-day decisions that you're navigating and learning how to utilize the data to have those critical discussions. But I loved your insight, particularly around the flexibility of utilizing data in the world of human resources, or POPs, as I now will call it.
Yay!
But you should copyright that. But thank you so much for joining us here today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I appreciate it tremendously. Take care.
Thank you for joining us on We Get Work. Please tune in to our next program where we will continue to tell you not only what's legal, but what is effective. We Get Work is available to stream and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Libsyn, SoundCloud, Spotify, and YouTube. For more information on today's topic, our presenters, and other Jackson Lewis resources, visit jacksonlewis.com. As a reminder, this material is provided for informational purposes only. It is not intended to constitute legal advice, nor does it create a client-lawyer relationship between Jackson Lewis and any recipient.